At 2:41 a.m. Washington time this morning, a decision was signed inside the White House that may have just shattered the political foundation of North America. In a classified emergency move, the United States activated a $935 billion economic strike against Canada, targeting key industries from aluminum and uranium to advanced energy technology, while issuing a 48-hour ultimatum to Prime Minister Mark Carney's government. Within minutes, financial trading systems in New York, London, and Tokyo began flashing abnormal volatility warnings as investors rushed to calculate the fallout of a confrontation few believed was possible between two of the world's closest allies. Yet, while markets were already reacting, most mainstream media outlets are still scrambling to understand what actually happened. So before we uncover what triggered this sudden rupture, why a 48-hour countdown is already ticking, and how this crisis could reshape the balance of power across North America, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the explanation you're about to hear is far more serious than what's being reported so far. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to break down the three developments that most media outlets are barely mentioning. First, we'll uncover what actually triggered Washington's sudden $935 billion economic strike against Canada, and why the timing shocked even senior diplomats. Second, we'll examine the hidden pressure building inside Prime Minister Mark Carney's government as financial markets begin reacting to the 48-hour ultimatum. And finally, at the end of this video, we'll reveal the worst-case scenario that analysts quietly fear could fracture the North American alliance if this countdown reaches zero. Stay with me, because the final piece of this puzzle changes everything. To understand how serious this situation really is, we need to step back and examine the sequence of signals that led to this moment. Because what happened at 2:41 a.m. in Washington was not a random decision. According to several diplomatic briefings circulating in financial and policy circles, this confrontation has been building quietly for more than 18 months. Evidence 1, the energy corridor dispute. The first major signal appeared in what analysts call the Great Lakes Energy Corridor dispute. This corridor, stretching across the industrial heartland of North America, moves billions of dollars worth of energy infrastructure and strategic resources between the United States and Canada every year. Over the last year, officials in Washington began raising concerns that new regulatory frameworks introduced under Prime Minister Mark Carney's government could give Ottawa indirect leverage over critical energy flows entering the U.S. Midwest. That might sound technical, but the numbers involved are staggering. Internal projections from several investment banks suggested that if these regulations were fully implemented, they could influence up to $214 billion in cross-border energy transactions annually. For American policymakers already concerned about supply chain resilience, that figure triggered serious alarm. This is where the tone inside Washington reportedly began to change. A retired 4-star U.S. general who advised on North American strategic planning recently warned that the issue was no longer purely economic. He argued that energy leverage between allies can quickly transform into strategic pressure, especially when global markets are already unstable. And that warning appears to have resonated inside the White House. Evidence 2, financial market signals. The second signal came not from politicians, but from the financial markets themselves. Within minutes of the emergency sanctions order being reported to trading desks, several Canadian-linked assets experienced unusual volatility. Currency traders began rapidly reassessing exposure to Canadian markets, while commodity analysts scrambled to evaluate potential disruptions in aluminum, uranium, and advanced battery supply chains. Remember, Canada is not a minor economic player. It is currently the largest trading partner of the United States, with total bilateral trade exceeding $1.3 trillion annually. Any disruption between these two economies sends shockwaves through global markets. This is why some analysts are already describing the situation as one of the most destabilizing economic confrontations between allied nations in decades. During a private economic forum last year, billionaire investor Warren Buffett made a remark that has recently resurfaced among financial commentators. He warned that when large, interconnected economies begin imposing sudden trade restrictions on each other, markets tend to react faster and more violently than governments expect. And that appears to be exactly what we are beginning to see. If you're starting to understand how serious this situation could become, take a moment to press like on this video, because the next piece of evidence makes the situation even more complicated. Evidence 3: diplomatic silence. One of the most unusual aspects of this crisis is what hasn't happened yet. Normally, when tensions emerge between allied governments, diplomatic channels begin working immediately behind the scenes. Public statements are released, negotiations are scheduled, and both sides attempt to calm markets. But in the hours following the sanctions announcement, something unusual occurred. Officials in both Washington and Ottawa reportedly avoided making detailed public statements, instead referring only to ongoing strategic discussions. For seasoned geopolitical observers, that kind of silence often signals intense private negotiations happening out of public view. Former constitutional law professor Alan Dershowitz once described these moments in international disputes as the most dangerous phase of any geopolitical standoff. Because when negotiations occur entirely behind closed doors, markets and the public are left guessing, and uncertainty tends to amplify fear, and fear moves markets. Evidence 4: the alliance factor. Perhaps the most dangerous dimension of this crisis involves the broader alliance system surrounding both countries. The United States and Canada are not just neighbors. They're also deeply integrated through multiple security and economic frameworks, including NATO and the G7. If tensions between them escalate further, the ripple effects could extend far beyond North America. European policymakers are already quietly monitoring the situation because disruptions between the US and Canada could affect global energy flows, industrial supply chains, and even military logistics cooperation within NATO. One European policy advisor recently described the situation as an internal stress test of the Western alliance. That phrase alone reveals how seriously some officials are beginning to take this confrontation. Because if two of the most closely aligned democracies in the world enter a prolonged economic conflict, the consequences would reach far beyond tariffs or sanctions. They would begin reshaping the balance of economic influence across the entire Western alliance. And that is why analysts around the world are now focusing on a single factor above everything else: the 48-hour deadline. Deadlines in diplomacy are rarely symbolic. They usually represent a moment when negotiations must produce a concrete outcome. If an agreement is reached before the clock runs out, tensions can de-escalate rapidly. But if the deadline expires without resolution, governments are often forced to escalate their actions to maintain credibility. Which brings us to the critical question that markets, policymakers, and investors are all asking right now. What happens when the countdown reaches 0? So now we arrive at the question that policymakers, investors, and diplomats around the world are quietly asking. What happens when the 48-hour deadline expires? Because once a government issues an ultimatum of this scale, the outcome usually falls into only a few possible paths. Scenario 1. Full concession. The first scenario is the fastest path to de-escalation. In this outcome, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government agrees to Washington's demands before the deadline expires. That could involve temporarily adjusting or suspending the disputed regulatory framework affecting the Great Lakes Energy Corridor, while allowing a joint U.S.-Canada monitoring mechanism to review future infrastructure decisions. If this happens, markets would likely stabilize quickly. Investors would interpret the move as a signal that both governments remain committed to preserving the $1.3 trillion North American trade relationship. However, such a concession would come at a political cost. Domestically, critics inside Canada could accuse Carney's government of yielding to economic pressure from Washington. Opposition figures might argue that Canada surrendered strategic leverage too quickly. So while this scenario could calm markets, it would also trigger serious political turbulence inside Ottawa. Scenario 2. Partial compliance. The second scenario is far more complicated. In this outcome, Canada offers partial adjustments rather than full concessions. Ottawa might propose technical changes to regulatory oversight or suggest a joint review panel involving both governments and independent energy authorities. Diplomatically, this would allow both sides to claim progress. Washington could argue that pressure forced Canada to negotiate. Ottawa could maintain that it defended national sovereignty while still engaging in dialogue. But markets rarely enjoy half solutions. Even a temporary standoff between the United States and its largest trading partner would introduce uncertainty across energy, industrial metals, and advanced technology supply chains. In other words, this scenario could prolong volatility while negotiations continue behind closed doors. Scenario 3. Strategic breakdown. The final scenario is the one analysts fear the most. If the 48-hour deadline expires without any meaningful agreement, the confrontation could escalate into a full-scale economic standoff between two of the world's most integrated economies. Additional sanctions could be introduced. Trade restrictions might expand into sectors that currently remain untouched, such as automotive manufacturing or cross-border financial services. At that point, the consequences would not remain limited to North America. Global markets would begin pricing in the possibility that a long-standing alliance had entered a period of strategic fragmentation. And history shows that once economic confrontations between major powers escalate beyond a certain threshold, they rarely unwind quickly. Which is why the next 48 hours may quietly become one of the most consequential diplomatic countdowns in recent North American history. Right now, the clock is still ticking. With every passing hour, the 48-hour deadline issued from Washington moves closer to a moment that could redefine the political and economic balance of North America. What began at 2:41 a.m. this morning as a sudden sanctions order has already triggered market anxiety, diplomatic silence, and intense speculation about how far this confrontation might go. Whether this crisis ends in negotiation, partial compromise, or a deeper economic rupture, one thing is becoming clear. The stability of the U.S.-Canada relationship can no longer be taken for granted. The next decision made in Washington or Ottawa could determine whether this standoff fades quietly or escalates into something far larger. So now I want to hear from you. Has Washington gone too far? Or is Canada facing the consequences of its own strategy? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every perspective. And if you want to follow the next developments in this story, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because this situation is still unfolding.